Welcome to Leaders Get Real. Inspirational interviews with today's authentic leaders. I'm your host, Christy Tong, bringing you insightful interviews with best-selling authors and with leaders who are purposeful, passionate, and authentic. Gain compelling insights as they share the challenges and rewards of leading with authenticity and impact. Welcome to today's interview with Dolly Chugh. Dolly's TED Talk was among last year's top 25 most popular. She's a Harvard PhD, now on the MBA faculty at NYU. She's had over 10 years experience in companies like Merrill Lynch and Time Inc., and also led leadership courses inside New York prisons. Dolly is smart, authentic, funny, and she'll help you become more of the person you mean to be. Dolly, I have really been looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to Leaders Get Real.
Oh, thank you, Christy. This is exciting.
Now, let me share the backstory for how we wound up here together. I was doing a recent podcast interview with Liz Wiseman, author of Multipliers.
Yes.
And I'd asked her back on the show for a special episode where I had premier leadership authors talking about their favorite books or most impactful books by other authors. And Liz, in that chat, talked about your book. And I'd not heard of it before. And The Person You Mean to Be, both the title and the description that she gave about the book, I was so compelled by it that I ordered it on Amazon that day. And I started the book 2 days later when it arrived. And I knew immediately that I wanted to have you on the show. So,
wow. Thank you. Thanks for that background. And thank you to Liz, if she's listening. I am a huge fan. She is a role model in not only as an author, but I think in terms of how she takes important ideas and brings them to all of us in a way we can digest. She's amazing.
Great. Well, let's start by talking about your research and your book. As I said, the title, The Person You Mean to Be. I love that title. And as a leadership coach, I partner with executives on a journey to help them become the leader they mean to be, which in essence is really becoming the person that they want to be. And in that coaching, we talk about often, that there's a gap between their intent and the effect they might have in a given scenario. And I see a lot of connections with that in your work. So tell us about that title and the premise of your book.
Yeah, thank you. It's so perfect what you just said about the gap. That really is it. I, in my own life, feel that gap on a regular basis. I care deeply about, a society where everyone has equal opportunity. And then at the same time, I see all sorts of ways in which I seem to favor people who went to certain kinds of schools or have certain kinds of backgrounds, or I notice myself kind of dismissing ideas from somebody who doesn't have a body type that I typically associate with being a leader. It's all these micro moments where I see my gap. And this book is about trying to take what I study as a scholar and what I struggle with as a human being, and the gap there, and try to curate the science and then real life stories together. Both, frankly, they say all research is me search, to help myself. And also, I think, to help so many people who I think are working through a lot of the same things. They care deeply. They believe deeply in diversity, inclusion. The question is how to build it. So the title speaks to exactly the gap that you work on with your clients around leadership. And in my case, it is also about leadership, and it's honing in on some specific issues about how do we manage issues around bias as it relates to our leadership.
And you are a social scientist. Tell us about your work, what it's focused on.
Yeah, I like to say it's focused on the psychology of good people. And my interest when I say the psychology of good people is the reality is, even though it doesn't always feel that way in the world, there's a lot of people who care about being good people and feeling like good people. There's actually data that shows that that's something that's meaningful to many of us, many of us. Even if we define like good person differently. And many of us do have different definitions. Like for one person, good person might mean you hold the door open for women. And for someone else, that may actually be an example of not being a good person, not treating everyone the same. So our definitions may vary. But what I'm interested in is not telling people what their definition of good person should be. That's, I'm agnostic on that. What I'm interested in, though, is once we see ourselves and strive to be good people, what's the psychology, what's the mindset around making that happen? And so my work, some of my work has focused on unconscious bias, which is an example of mental stereotypes we might not even be aware we have. I may think of that I am viewing men and women equally as having the same leadership potential, let's say, and that may be my explicit conscious belief. But on an unconscious level, I may, in fact, in ways that I don't even realize, be interrupting women a little sooner than men, or, dismissing, not giving credit to women. And in fact, those examples I just gave you are exact behaviors that my teaching assistant tracked me doing in a classroom with my students. That's exactly the pattern I was showing, that despite feeling like I am a feminist and I have two daughters, I am on an unconscious level. I have this gap that is showing up in these micro moments in my behavior. So psychology of good people, it's what I study as a social psychologist, and it gets at ways in which we strive to be good people, but sometimes it's harder to do than we realize.
Yes, and your book is so filled with data and reference to, all this evidence-based research. And I was just struck by your comments about how driven we are to be a good person to ourselves and to be seen by other people as a good person. It reminded me, I worked years ago with the author of The Leadership Challenge, Jim Kouzes, and another book he wrote was called Credibility. And I helped him design a workshop for executives on credibility. And we discovered that it was actually really hard to sell a workshop on credibility because everybody thinks they're credible.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Everybody wants to be credible or perceives themselves as credible. Like I'm a good person. I'm honest. I'm credible. And so that's when it really hit me that, each of us thinks of ourselves as an honest person. Each of us thinks of ourselves as trustworthy. And then your work, a good person. I want to be seen as a good person, and I judge myself on my intentions. But other people might see something different in my actions.
Exactly. And I might be so committed to that idea that I'm a good person. For some of us, it's not just that we see ourselves that way. We're married to that idea.
Yeah.
I really, and we see it. The only other alternative to being a good person is to be a bad person. And we view that as just no way am I going there.
Yeah.
And so it really becomes like a cliff where we're in this very narrow ledge on a cliff, and either we are a good person or we aren't. It's very either or.
Yes.
And what we know as social psychologists is that's actually not how human behavior works. There's lots of in between.
Yes, lots of in between. And, you draw out how driven we are to protect that. And, as I was just reflecting and reading your book of like, oh yeah, I do things all the time. Like I definitely want to be seen as a good person. And yet I do things all the time where I'm not the person that I want to be or mean to be. I get in the carpool lane when I'm the only one in the car, and as if, my meeting's more important than all the other people who are slowly going in the lane beside me following the law. And I may not look that homeless person in the eye as I walk into that store. And, and yet I want to be that good person. And I want others to see me as that as well. And I probably do far more than I even realized in reading your work to actually protect that or to defend, like, the reason I did that is because, and I've got all kinds of rationale to defend it and so on.
Right. Exactly. The red zone. I call that the red zone. Like our minds are really good. Like it's like a pit crew gets to work in our minds to protect that good person identity.
Great. You say, and this is what really hit me when I first heard you speak in your TED Talk, but you say we should abandon the idea of being a good person, that it's actually getting in our way of becoming a better person. So say a word about that.
Right. So I'm being provocative, but I actually am also being literal. So the notion that because we care about being good people, it's getting in the way of us being better people. So, for example, in that moment when I'm interrupting female students more than male students, and my teaching assistant, who's sitting there tallying it in her notebook, like she's got the data and she's telling me about it, there's a moment where, of course, I go into that red zone defensiveness. My little mental pit crew, quickly is coming up with all the explanations to sort of repair my my good person identity. That moment is the moment where I could learn. I could actually get better in that moment. But what most of us do most of the time is protect the good person identity. So the more we care about that good person identity, the harder we work to protect it. And so what I don't do is actually look at the data in that particular example. What I don't do is ask the teaching assistant, well, tell me more. What did you see me do? When did I do that? How did I do that? What I don't do is think about how I can prevent it going forward. What I don't do is reflect on where did that come from? What I don't do is think about how am I going to notice it when I don't have a teaching assistant tracking it? When I'm not in the classroom, how am I going to notice it when I'm just talking to students in the hallway, when it's nothing formal? Though that's the learning I'm depriving myself of. So when I say that we need to let go of being a good person in order to become a better person, that's what I mean is let's send the pit crew home and let our other muscles, our growth muscles, our learning muscles do the work in that moment. And it's hard because I know my instinct is, again, I want to protect that good person thing. This is where I really draw a lot on the research of Carol Dweck at Stanford University. Carol Dweck and her colleagues have done the very respected and well-known work on growth versus fixed mindset. And so in a fixed mindset, we view ourselves as either we are something or we aren't. We're kind of where we are. And that's what I call you're a good person or you're not. That's that tiny ledge against the cliff. Versus a growth mindset where I view myself as having room to grow and learn. I'm a work in progress. Maybe I'm great, but I can still get better. Or maybe I'm just starting, or maybe I'm in the middle, but whatever it is, I can keep. And so, in that moment where teaching assistant says, you're cutting off women quite a bit and you're not calling on them as much as men, that's the moment where if I'm seeing myself as a work in progress, I'm still mortified. It's not that I'm not mortified, but my mental activity in attention turns to figuring it out. How can I get better? And in fact, there's been research that's looked at brain activity when we are in a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. And that's something we can activate from moment to moment. When I'm in a fixed mindset and a mistake is pointed out to me, my brain actually pulls attention away from the mistake. So I think these studies, actually, people were doing math problems and they make a mistake on the math problem. They're in the mindset of I'm either good at math or I'm not. I can't get better. It is what it is. Mistake is pointed out, and their attention goes down. So in exactly the moment where you would want to pay attention, like, oh, well, what did I do? What did I not carry the one? What happened? I'm actually like pulling away from the mistake. Versus in a growth mindset, same thing, math problem, they see brain activity spike. It really starts bubbling up. Because, oh my God, a mistake. I got to figure this out. So next time I know how to carry the one. And the same thing happens when the teaching assistant is showing me who I'm calling on and who I'm interrupting. that's the moment where you want my brain activity to go up.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Instead of
so the
shutting down.
provocative statement, yes, instead of shutting down. And so the provocative statement is let's stop trying to be good people. Let's just
Mm.
stop. Let's let go of it and let's instead try to be goodish people. And goodish is not meant to be a lower standard than good. To be really clear, it's actually meant to be a higher standard. It's meant to be the growth mindset version, that I'm going to take ownership for my learning. It's not just I assume I've got this.
Mm-hmm.
It's I'm going to assume that sometimes I got it and sometimes I don't. And when I don't, I'm going to figure it out.
Oh, that's fabulous. And the good ish gives us permission that we don't have to cover up mistakes or slip
That's
ups
right.
or comment we made
That's
that
right.
seemed insensitive. We can actually say, wait, I'm good-ish, and I still have some things to learn, and I still have things
That's
that
right.
can be pointed out to me, and I can still go forward.
Exactly. And the key part there is that I'm going to go forward. I'm not going to, because some people, there's been some critique of, is that just an excuse that, well, I mean, everyone has blind spots. I guess I'm goodish. That is not the definition of goodish. The definition of goodish is actually, oh, wow, I get to work on this. This is something I need to pay attention to. So that's a really important piece of the goodishness. It's yes, we can be open about it as long as we're willing to work on it.
Mm-hmm. Great. And it struck me, your phrase, instead of trying to be a good person, try to be a good ish person. And I thought,
Yeah.
that's fabulous in the world I'm in and coaching leaders. And for
Yeah.
myself, rather than trying to be a good leader, that I protect my image as a good leader, that I try
Yeah.
to be a good ish leader that's a work in
Yeah.
progress, that can always be
Yeah.
getting better and is open
Right.
to learning and seeing things I'm doing that aren't who I mean to be as a leader, and so on.
I love that.
Okay, so we're going to be able to tie this down to some good conversation about leadership and how this all plays in. But I'm thinking it's helpful to back up a little bit and get some good foundation. Your subtitle is How Good People Fight Bias, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the book was so insightful for me about how much bias exists, how much unconscious
Mm.
bias I have, and that
Yeah.
all of us have.
Yes. You're not alone. Right.
And I think that's something that's sort of a growing area that people are starting to become aware of. But tell us about some of that foundational research that helps underscore that bias that we may still be unaware how much that's there.
Absolutely. So I would say one of the most important developments in psychology in the last 50 years is the much deeper understanding that a lot of what's happening in our mind is not happening within our awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So think of the times you've driven home or had a busy day of meeting with clients, and your mind is full. You're driving, and you get home and you think back to that drive and you think, my gosh, I don't even remember the drive. Like,
Mm.
I obviously drove
Mm-hmm.
safely and got home safely, but my mind was so busy that I was pretty much on autopilot, and my brain somehow knew where to turn and
Yep.
to stop at red lights, and it did the work. That is a perfect example of the ways in which a huge percentage, some people say well over 95, 98, 99% of our mental processing is taking place outside of our awareness.
Mm.
Another calculation that's been made says that, like if I snap my fingers, that was a snap. In that little snap, in that moment, each of our brains processed 11 million pieces of information.
Mm-hmm.
11 million, but only 40 pieces, 40 of them consciously. 11 million
Mm-hmm.
minus 40 was taking place on autopilot in ways we weren't even aware of. We weren't consciously noting our body temperature. We weren't consciously deciding to sit or stand, but all that was happening somehow in our brains.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, there have been 3 Nobel Prizes in the last 50 years that each is essentially hinged on this idea of automaticity, all that work that's happening automatically in our brains. So if we accept that to be true, and there's so much research that suggests it is, then we get to, so what are the implications of that for how we see other people? How do we perceive others? And one of the things we know is that the faster I associate two ideas together, it tends to be the stronger I associate them. So for example, if I say peanut butter, you say
jelly.
Jelly, exactly. And like, I'm guessing, Christy, that you don't remember the specific moment in your life when peanut butter and jelly became associated in your
As
mind.
As one.
Right, but it just sort of was what you breathed in. If you grew up in the United States, that's sort of an association.
Yep.
And so we can quickly associate those two ideas, and that means they're also strongly associated in our minds. So the idea of unconscious bias or implicit bias, and for the sake of general conversation, we can just say those are synonyms, unconscious or implicit bias, is what other things are we associating together quickly and therefore also strongly. And so in measuring that, what we have to do is not just ask people what they think, because if you just ask people, for example, what do you think of women? What do you think of gay people? What do you think of Black people? What do you think of immigrants? What you're getting at is not the 11 million part of the brain, you're getting at the 40. We have lots of ways to measure the 40. We all get surveys constantly, like everything. You go to the bank, they give you the survey, and that's a measure of the 40 part of your brain, the part that's not on autopilot. But the part that this newer understanding of the mind, that so much is happening through automatic processing, is tougher to measure. That's where peanut butter jelly sits. And so there's been lots of work by lots of scholars. The three most well-known are Anthony Greenwald, Mahjong Banaji, and Brian Nosek, and they are the creators of what's called the IAT, or the Implicit Association Test, which is one measure. It is far from perfect. They will be the first to tell you everything that could be better about it. But in the science we have now, it's the best measure we have so far, and the most widely used measure. Over 10,000 peer-reviewed academic papers have used this measure to see what are those associations. What is the peanut butter jelly associations we're making? And so, for example, if any of your listeners wants to take this test, it's free and it's anonymous. And it's totally for research purposes at implicit.harvard.edu. And there's no need to register or put in your email. Just go in as a guest. There you'll see the guest option. And what you'll find there are options to measure your unconscious biases in a whole range of categories, and you can pick which one you want to explore.
And I did. I went and took it.
You did?
I was so intrigued for this 10-minute survey. And I want to go do several, because there's many of them. But I just picked the one on gender, and I took it. And lo and behold, I discovered, as much as I have incredibly high expectations of women as leaders in all fields. I live in the Silicon Valley. And so I'm in tech companies working with lots of engineers and so on. But I could see in my results that I associate science and engineering with men, and women with liberal arts. And yet that's not in my conscious mind,
exactly.
That I would think that like men are better at that than women. By no means do I believe that. I see very effective, successful, smart women scientists and engineers all the time. But my associations, that's what, in the quick moments of me associating things, that's what it showed. And I thought, okay, so despite my conscious thought about women and so on, where does that come from? Like, well, okay, my stepdad was an aerospace engineer. My mom was a homemaker, and I work in the Silicon Valley. I coach a lot of men engineers. There's a lot more men engineers than women.
Yes,
and
yes,
so
yes.
on. So as much as
Yeah, that's great. And that's the reflection that's meant to happen after the test. You are not alone. The majority of men and the majority of women get the same results as you. I also got that same result. And that's exactly sort of what we're trying to unpack. I encourage people, take the test that you feel pretty confident about, take the test that you're dreading, that, is sort of the topic you hope doesn't come up over holiday meals with your family.
Yeah.
That's probably the test you should be taking.
And yeah, I want to take some other areas. And, one of the areas I just care deeply about is the area of cultural and racial biases. And I'm intrigued because I live in a progressive place. I live in California, where it can be easy for white people, for example, to fall into the mindset that, there's no racial discrimination anymore. That was back then. That was when there were separate water fountains. And even to think, I certainly don't discriminate against people. And yet, these unconscious connections we've been talking about are influencing things all the time. Even though good people who explicitly don't think of themselves as having any associations or making any of these choices, you point out so much research that when some people, let's say whites, white Americans may think that, everybody's treated equally.
Right.
That the minority group has a very different perception and experience of that.
That's right. That's right. People who aren't necessarily from the same background as me, or the same native language as me, or the same skin color as me, or the same schools as me, is everyone experiencing this the same way as I am? That's part of being good. It's sort of stepping outside of our own experience. The cliche of, just because it's not raining where you are doesn't mean it isn't raining where I am.
Yes. And you point out so many good data points about that. I think it was...
I think the statistic you're remembering is in the 1960s.
Yep.
They asked white Americans versus Black Americans in one of these national polls that's done regularly to talk about whether or not, I think the question was something along the lines of whether, one of the questions was whether they thought the civil rights movement was moving too fast. And the majority of whites felt it was moving too fast. And the majority of Blacks did not feel it was moving too fast, and felt that it, in fact, needed to continue at the pace it was at. And I think for most of us sitting in 2019, when we hear that, and we know that in the 60s, we had white and colored water fountains. We had, imagine the world today, that if I went to Panera, and I'm not white, and if you went to Panera, that if you and I couldn't have lunch together at Panera, that we would have to sit in separate places. That's a world we were talking about that's within the lifetime of many people who are still alive today.
Yeah.
And yet the majority of white Americans felt things were moving too quickly to dismantle that. Now we look back at that, and of course it just seems so... I think most people look back at that and feel that's a bit, it feels so odd.
Yes.
And yet that's the reality. Is when Muhammad Ali was vocal, he was not beloved. He was considered by some to be the most hated man in America. Now we look at him with reverence. Our perspectives really change over time.
Yes. And that was some great data. And you also described in the 60s that 4 years before the Supreme Court declared that whites and blacks could marry, there was the statistic that 80% of white Americans felt that racial minorities were treated equally. And it's like, what? And I just, I read that and thought, you provided this wonderful narrative of how many times the majority has gotten it wrong.
Yeah.
When the majority said, yep, everything's good, or we're treated equally, or yes, there's no, there's no racial discrimination. And yet the minority had a incredibly different response rate.
Yes.
And
exactly.
And so that idea that bias exists, And there are very different views. And yet often a majority, a majority person may not realize that there is bias happening or that there are challenges still being faced by that minority. And
that's right. That's very well said.
And, it blew me away back to some of those, perspectives like, oh, no, there is no racism or, discrimination. Back to the setting in California in recent years, a very good friend of mine who's Black. He's a very sharp dresser, just like to the T, dresses very nice, brand name kind of high-end dresser. And he was shopping at a department store at Christmas time and left the department store with all of his bags and was stopped by security on his way out. And then interrogated and questioned. Why? Why was he? Now, clearly, there's still some things going on. And yet
Absolutely.
People say,
and I think many Black Americans or people of color would report similar experiences in retail spaces. And many of us, I know, and I have taught my children the same thing. They don't always listen to me, but that when we walk out of a store, you hold the receipt very visibly in your hand facing upward as you walk out of the store. I don't know how many white parents are telling their children to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't, and it's a genuine question. I don't know.
Yes.
But I will tell you that I don't know how many Black Americans, but that is something that that is something you do.
Yep. Yes. There's talk in your book about headwinds and tailwinds. And some of what you were just describing about some of the challenges potentially where you actually take effort to educate your daughters, for example, hold that receipt, or share with us about the whole idea of headwinds and tailwinds that some may experience more than others.
That's right. So this metaphor is one that I love, and I've borrowed from Debbie Irving, who's crafted this idea. The notion is that, let's say I go out for a run and I'm kind of doing my usual. I'm going to run to that fire hydrant, and then when I get to the fire hydrant, I'm going to do the little U-turn and come back home. And on the way to the fire hydrant, I'm feeling pretty good. And I'm like, I think it's paying off, this working out I'm doing. I'm cruising. And then I get to the fire hydrant and I turn around, and suddenly there's this wind in my face, and I'm like, whoa! It's like every step is an effort. And I'm moving slower. It might look like to an outsider that I'm not trying as hard. I look less motivated because it's really tough, but it's invisible, this headwind that's in front of me. When I was on my way to the fire hydrant and felt like it was me doing really well, what I was actually experiencing was a tailwind. That a tailwind is not something anyone can see or feel even, but it's moving us forward and giving us a little bit of a boost. It's invisible but influential.
Yep.
And then that headwind sort of is the reverse of it. And so what this metaphor, I think, helps us think about, particularly in terms of what's visible to others, is what happens when as a society or within our institution or within our companies and organizations, when certain things are not necessarily sitting within what one individual did to another, but just are sort of the way we do things that create certain expectations. So, for example, if the main social outing is going to be a golf outing, or if the sort of informal way we get together is that we go to bars, traditionally in those settings, there are really strong gender roles on golf courses, and sometimes there's even exclusions on some golf courses. In bars, there's sort of all sorts of gendered behaviors that happen. So it is going to take potentially what could have been an equitable interaction in the workplace and create a bit of a headwind and tailwind for some people outside of the workplace. And it won't be visible. So if I'm in the context where I feel I am welcome, and I've always been welcome, it's like I'm running to the fire hydrant. Like, I don't feel the fact that other people are feeling a little uncomfortable, or Other people had to go, take golf lessons just to show up at this because they
Uh-huh.
didn't come from a background where golf was a thing. And I'm just picking two random
Yeah,
examples. The
that's great.
idea is to think about where we might, as a society or as an organization, unknowingly be creating forces. If events always happen at a certain time, or in my classes, in business schools in general, not just specific to my classes, class participation is often a big part of the grade. That's just
Mm-hmm.
kind of the way business schools
Yep.
are. But there's no reason why they have to be that way. And it certainly favors a very certain kind of personality to be
Mm-hmm.
someone who, in a class of 60 to 90 people, is willing to every single class get their hand up there
Yeah,
and
the
fight for
extrovert.
airtime. The
Mm-hmm.
extrovert. And then you're fighting against the headwind, because remember, your professor's calling on men more than women and
Mm-hmm.
interrupting women more than men, right? So now
Mm-hmm.
you've got a headwind to deal with in me
Yep.
that's not visible, but it's real.
Yep. And you talk about believers and builders, and you mentioned it a little
Yeah,
bit, but
sure.
say a little bit more, because I want to take that chat into the workplace and think
Sure.
about leaders and how we can go from being a believer to a builder.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the idea is, I wrote a book that was for people who believe in diversity, inclusion, equity, equality. I didn't write a book trying to convince anyone to believe in those things. I know not everyone does.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
we got to do that work too. Probably not the right person to do that work, but I wrote a book for, like, okay, you believe in it. You're like you said, so many of
Mm-hmm.
in the community you live in, so many people do believe in it.
Mm-hmm.
But now, what's the how to? Because
Mm-hmm.
believing in it is not enough. Believing in it does not undo headwinds at
Yes.
all. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
it just reinforces headwinds. So the building part is, what are the skills I need? What is the knowledge I need? What are the behaviors I need to actually not just believe in diversity and inclusion, but build a more diverse and inclusive workforce, community, neighborhood, school,
Mm.
family.
Yeah. And I think the first step that you talk about in becoming a builder is that growth mindset.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. It's actually viewing, like, taking every domain: public speaking, drawing, math, accounting.
Mm-hmm.
We have a belief that's either a mindset around, I can get better at this, or that I am where I am and I'm not going to change. That's a
Mm-hmm.
fixed versus growth mindset.
Mm-hmm.
On this issue of being a good person, diversity, inclusion, to very actively adopt a growth mindset. And, one of the stories I tell in the book is of Rick Clow, who's at Google Ventures. And he's really impressed me with exactly how he has embraced a growth mindset. And so what he shares is that, he saw himself as one of the good guys. Like,
Mm-hmm.
he's like, I hire women, I promote women, I'm trying to, create an environment where people from all nationalities and races are welcome and thriving. And he's in
Mm-hmm.
high tech, and Google Ventures actually represents such an interesting, venture capital
Mm-hmm.
and technology,
Mm-hmm.
two areas that are both sort of trying to do work in this area. And what he realized is that he went to an unconscious bias training that his boss required them all to go to. He went kind of like, yeah, okay, I'll go because I'm a good citizen, but I don't really need this, kind of was his
Yep.
quiet subtext. And he took the same IAT test that you did, and he got results that surprised him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, wait, I thought I was one of the good guys.
Uh-huh.
And what he did in that moment, I think, I don't know that he would have labeled it this way if he had the vocabulary that I'm using, but he basically activated a growth mindset. Instead
Mm-hmm.
of saying, that obviously is a flawed
Mm-hmm.
test, he
Yep.
said, I'm going to learn more about this. I'm going to read about the test. I'm going to see, what are the scientists saying about it? Okay, I see there's like stuff we can improve, but overwhelming scientific support. So now I'm going to go look further into my own. I'm going to do like an audit of my own
Mm-hmm.
interactions. And one place he started was social media, because he is fairly influential through social media,
Mm-hmm.
Twitter, LinkedIn, and so
Mm-hmm.
on. So he managed to write some quick code or find some code that could quickly do a sort of rough gender analysis, just using male and female, kind of a gender binary of the names of the voices he's listening to on social media. Who is he connected to? And to his surprise, he found that he was connected to 80% men and 20% women, which was not what he thought he was going to find. He thought, he's one of the good guys. He's out there listening to everybody. He's connecting to everybody. In fact, he's, actively promoting women. And so, again, another moment where he could have just gone into the red zone, but he activated his growth mindset. He went into his go to space and said, wow, this is really interesting. I'm going to keep looking. And he just kept looking. Well, what panels have I been on? Who am I interviewing? And he just kept looking for more and more examples. And that's why I think he's such a wonderful case study of activating a growth mindset. That's where he started, was, okay, I'm just going to keep learning. What else can I figure out? What else can I figure out about myself? And not shut down in that moment.
Great. And there's so many good and practical things in your book as you talk about these 4 phases of evolving into a builder. And I love that you point out some different things, some places, I think, to activate into that builder. You talk about meetings as one place. What would be some things, good food for thought for us as leaders to think about how to be a builder in meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. So I interviewed Tony Profit for the book. He's a chief equality officer at Salesforce. And as many people have probably heard or read or may work at Salesforce, they're at the forefront of really trying to push the envelope on these issues. And so, I asked him, so tell me, what are the big things Salesforce is doing these days? And what are you doing as chief equality officer? And I was waiting for some really gigantic initiative or something. And he said, and there are, to be very clear, there are gigantic initiatives. I'm not suggesting there aren't. But what I was really surprised at what he said first. He said, run better meetings. We're trying to run better meetings. And I was like, okay. I mean, that's kind of like, I teach a managerial skills class to my MBAs, and that's like one of the nuts and bolts skills we work on is how to run a meeting, how to run a meeting that isn't a colossal waste of time. So I was interested in unpacking what he meant, and it got deep. It's so important what he said. He said, whatever's happening in your organization is happening in your meetings. Whoever's being included and excluded, whoever's being talked over, whoever's not getting credit, whoever's not part of the decision making, whoever's not even invited to the meeting, like all of whatever's happening in the meetings, and by meetings we can mean everything from groups of people co-located in a conference room to the Slack conversations or the email threads or all the ways, the hallway conversations. These are all meetings. He said if we paid more attention and were intentional to those thousands of moments in those meetings and began to address the little micro headwinds and tailwinds. So if somebody got talked over, let's go back to them and bring it back. Let's think about how to balance airtime in the meetings, because most meetings don't have balanced airtime. And not because we're trying to be cute and kindergarten about it, because if we didn't want someone's input in the meeting, why are they there? Let's actually run better meetings. That's basic leadership. And so what leaders can do to sort of build their builder skills in meetings is it's so interesting that this is a good double dip. Exactly what we know from just basic leadership and management skills is better meetings. Everything from ensuring there isn't one constituency who's dominating the airtime to ensuring that dissent can happen in a constructive and honest way, to ensuring that time is well spent, that our most precious commodity is not being wasted. All of those things turn out to be exactly the same things that contribute to more inclusive organizations. So that's why it's the most beautiful double dip. It's like better in general, and it's also better on this specific issue.
And isn't there even research that has validated the outcomes for groups where there's more equal distribution in the discussion?
Absolutely. So there's certainly lots of research that shows that everything from better information exchange in particular being a critical mechanism. So there was this beautiful meta-analysis that looked at all the studies out there where the question was, does diversity help business? What is the business case for diversity? And it turns out if you look at the studies, sometimes diversity helps performance and sometimes it doesn't. So you're like, what's going on here? So the big meta-analysis tried to unpack that. This is by Kathy Phillips and her co-author. What's interesting is the difference with information exchange. When information is being exchanged in a way where it's constructive and dissent is embraced and people aren't holding back unique information because they don't feel their voice is valued, that's when diversity actually leads to better results, more creativity, better profits, everything, all the outcomes we care about. When we bring diverse people in the room, diversity of people in the room, but we don't actually take advantage of the diverse perspectives, in other words, we don't have information exchange, then we just have a lot of people who don't understand each other very well.
Yeah, and that is such a tangible thing. And I know I am probably more guilty than anyone, in this arena, where I'm an extrovert and I actually probably am going where the energy is, where the extroverts are speaking out and not actually, and now from some of what you and others' work has revealed, I'm probably calling on men more than women or, all those things. Like there's all this stuff that's, unconsciously happening. And if I get more intentional, there's going to be better results if I find ways for some of the unspoken voices to be heard and from the unsaid ideas to be brought out into the table.
Exactly. And it's something I think we can all work on. Like there's no perfection in meeting running. It's definitely a place where we're all works in progress.
And say a little bit about credit sharing. That seems like it's a critical area too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so the classic study of they took heterosexual married couples and they asked them to say what percent of the work in the home they contribute, and they asked the husband and they asked the wife, and then they added up the percents, and it was 137%. If I remember right. Everybody thought they contributed well over a half. Yep. So that's a result that's been replicated across lots of groups, like teams of scientists and other teams, that this is just a pattern that we all tend to overclaim credit. It's not unique to one population or one gender or anything like that. But credit sharing requires us to sort of reverse that a little bit, that we need to not just sort of acknowledge that we all have a tendency to be able to see our own contributions a little better than we see others, but also to know that because of all those unconscious biases that are associating, let's say, men with engineering, that the contributions of groups that are not typically associated with those kinds of outcomes are likely to be overlooked. And so credit sharing is really important, that part of being a builder is being really good at noticing when credit isn't going where credit is due, when we have sort of unseen work and unrecognized contributions that will often come from exactly the groups who are trying to attract more. If you're in an organization that's trying to attract more women and attract more people of color, like you have this definite imbalance in your numbers, and yet the women who are there and the people of color there are not feeling their work they're getting credit for their work, you can see how you end up in a vicious cycle. So this is an example of, in order to counter the headwind, we have to really actively share credit.
That's powerful. And yet, given that we're all driven, as we said in the beginning of the conversation, to be seen as good people or to be seen as effective people and so on, and humans have a natural tendency to overestimate their own contribution. We've got an uphill battle here for really going the counterintuitive and pointing to credit to everybody but ourselves, for example, in a situation as a leader.
I think that's right. And I think strong leaders are really good at this, right?
Yes.
Like strong leaders are rarely taking credit.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, they'll take the blame but not the credit. And
Yes.
so this is actually, I think, for people who are comfortable in their own skin as
Yes.
leaders,
Yeah.
it's not too hard to distribute credit. It's just more a matter of like, make sure you're distributing it accurately.
Yeah.
That you're not sort of, kind of over crediting some folks and under crediting others.
Yeah. Somebody was just telling me on this whole idea of credit sharing. Abby Wambach, the U.S. soccer player, I think, has come out with a book called Wolfpack. And people describe, and I haven't followed soccer as closely, but people describe that when she makes a goal, she'll stop and she'll point at the person who passed it or the people who led up to the play. And I thought, what a powerful leadership example. Of just becoming conscious. We kind of go about what we're doing and people might give us praise, like the crowds are going wild for you for what you just did in that project, and to actually stop them and go, but wait a minute, like it feels good that I'm getting recognition. It feels good that people are praising this project, or there's emails going out saying, but how do I stop and think, wait, who was really a part of this? Who is contributing? And who, might be facing a lot of headwinds that I could put a spotlight on because of the chance that I've had for that spotlight as a leader, and really put somebody else in that spotlight.
I love that. And the Abby Wambach example is so wonderful. I haven't read Wolfpack, but I read the memoir she wrote before Wolfpack, and she talks about her own evolution of going from being a little more individualistic to more seeing the team. So it is something that we can learn. And I will say also that my experience is, when you shine a light on someone who isn't typically getting the credit they deserve, they walk through fire for you. They walk through fire for you.
Now, this is a podcast about authentic leadership. And so let's hone in on that theme. How would you describe what authentic leadership means or looks like to you?
Yeah. Well, I appreciated just knowing that you're doing this work on authentic leadership. To me, it's a place where you're speaking from a place of security. Authentic leadership is feeling secure in who you are, and secure that that's enough. So it's not about trying to be a different kind of person or hide something. It's about, I am enough. Doesn't mean I'm not always trying to get better and I'm growing and growth mindset, all of that. I'm not trying to contradict that, but it's authentic leadership. When I am around it, it usually means someone who I feel sees themselves as complete, growing and complete.
Oh, that's a great picture. And as I've watched you in some TED Talks and some other interviews and in your book, I see you as an authentic person, absolutely, in the way that you show up.
Oh, thank you. It's a very compliment, especially coming from you, who does this work with such grace and expertise.
You're in academia, and yet you still have a lot of examples and leadership, learnings and all that. But you worked inside corporations for over a decade. You were at Morgan Stanley and Merrill and Scholastic and so on.
Yes.
In any of those experiences, what's a get real moment when you had to initiate an authentic conversation with a person or a group that was impactful?
Yeah. There's a story that I think, just for space reasons, we ended up dropping from the book, but I really like it. It was a situation where a white male colleague was introducing a black female colleague. She was going to give a talk, and he was the one giving the introduction, and she was fairly new, so he was kind of the person who was legitimizing her with this introduction. And he gave a lovely introduction, but he did one of those little fun fact things. And in the fun fact, He just told a joke that to me kind of evoked a lot of
Mm-hmm.
racial stereotypes in that moment of Black women in particular. And he didn't mean any harm by it, but I thought it did terrible harm to her
Mm-hmm.
as her first
Mm-hmm.
presentation in this group. And afterwards, I remember, you know, being a wimp and going and sort of griping to my office
Mm-hmm.
mate and just, like I
Mm-hmm.
didn't really know him that well. And so I just griped to my office mate and that was terrible. And I can't believe he did that and blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
And I just went on all day. And finally, she couldn't listen to me anymore and just said, why don't you go talk to him? Tell him
Mm-hmm.
this so he can learn from it. And I was like, well, no, I mean, no. I mean, he's like, no, I'm just going to talk behind his back all day. She said, no, no, no. Like she knew him a little better than I did. And she said, I really think you should tell him. I don't think he realizes.
Mm-hmm.
And he would want to know. So not because I felt any deep motivation to do this, but because I was now sort of cornered by my own hypocrisy, I sort of had no choice.
And you wanted to be a good person, right?
I know. I was just like, so this was definitely me, like my big mouth getting me into trouble. So I, bashfully go and knock on his door. And I say, yeah, I don't know if you know who I am, but blah, blah. And I start to say what I was concerned about. And, that's the moment I expected the door to close and him to be like, who do you think you are? And the red zone and the pit crew and all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, his face lit up.
Mm.
And he said, oh my gosh, I want to learn more about this. Do you have time? Can I grab a chair? Would you sit down?
Mm.
And he just, oh my gosh, I will never forget the human embodiment of a growth mindset in that moment that I saw in him. We're now very close friends. And it all started in that conversation where I can't claim that I volunteered to have that authentic conversation. I was pushed to do it, but since then I've had more conversations like that because I was so surprised at his willingness to learn, and it really, I dropped a little bit of my cynicism as a result.
Wonderful. Now, we've been talking about so many good things here that spark on a lot of different elements. My listeners love when guests offer an idea or a challenge or something they can do immediately in response to the things that they're hearing about. So what are one or two actions that listeners can take by tomorrow or, in the next week to begin putting these into practice?
Yeah. Fantastic. So we've actually already talked about two of them. Let me name them. One was doing an audit. And by audit, I mean, look at whatever it is you consume. It could be books, it could be movies, it could be music, it could be podcasts, it could be social media, whatever the thing is that you consume. Look at the last 5 to 10 of the thing you consumed. And how wide a range of voices are you hearing, both in the actual voices as well as the creators behind the voices of the thing? How similar are they to each other? How similar are they to you? So this was the Rick Clouse story, his social media audit. You can do it with movies. You can do it with anything you consume. So that's one thing we can do right away. The second thing we can do right away that we've already talked about is running better meetings. So the next meeting you're in, just take on the act of being a noticer. Don't try to change anything that's happening, but try to notice who's talking and who's not, who's there and who's not, who's being interrupted and who's not, who's being encouraged to speak more, who's not. Be a good noticer, and then start to form like, okay, now what can I do to sort of reverse these headwinds and tailwinds? That we can do right away.
Great things, really tangible that we can go and do immediately. And this has been so helpful.
Oh, good.
And I just circle back to where we started, where you said, our attempts to protect our image as a good person are getting in the way. We need to be a good-ish person. And you talk about how, there's so many things that we get training in. If you're going to be an accountant, then go take a course. You want to be a good parent, you read a book. But
that's right.
People just sort of assume that we know how to be a good person. And,
exactly.
And so we actually shy away from putting ourselves out there and saying, I didn't know, I didn't understand, teach me, help me know more, help me do it differently next time. And you have given us so many examples of ways that we can become a better person, a good-ish person, and a good-ish leader as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Christy. That was a wonderful summary, and it's very wonderful to be on this journey with you. Thank you for being goodish by my side.
Terrific. Thanks for tuning in today. If you'd like to get Dolly's book, click the Reads button at leadersgetreal.com. To connect with Dolly or resources from our interview, be sure to check out the show notes in the podcast tab at leadersgetreal.com. And until next time, go forth and get real.